They were very worried that the Genocide Convention, as they saw it, would be applied to the way that African Americans were treated in the American South. In other words, that Jim Crow would be genocide, and the lynchings and the state terror that African Americans faced from the Civil War era forward was genocide.
Why in the world should it be so hard to call a genocide? Well, the answer may depend on how one could benefit from keeping that definition vague. Today's guest, Keith Watenpaugh, is one of the country's leading experts on human rights and the history of genocide. Stay tuned. It's going to be a great conversation. So let's just get into America's favorite Thanksgiving dinner conversation, genocide.
Genocide, all right.
A lot of what you are focusing on is the definition of the actual word in the application, who is allowed to actually claim genocide. So,
yeah, I think probably a good place to start is, where did the genocide idea come from? Is it okay to start there?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. So the genocide idea is connected with a man by the name of Raphael Lemkin. Lemkin was a bright Eastern European thinker. He was from part of Poland that's now in Ukraine. He was from a secularized Jewish family. And during the interwar period, meaning the period after the First World War, but leading into the Second World War, Lemkin, who worked as a lawyer for the Polish government, became very interested in how international law could be brought to bear to protect peoples against states intent on destroying them. And he drew his inspiration, or the question itself, from a historical experience that he had witnessed, had learned about in his early years in college, which was the 1915 destruction of the Armenian citizens of the Ottoman Empire. In 1915, following generations of persecution and efforts to displace the Armenians, the Ottoman state had used the pretext of the First World War to answer what was called the Armenian question once and for all, and rounded Armenian communities up, separated men and women, murdered the men outright, sent the women, children, and elderly on the road to the desert, where most of them died. And indeed, just as a side note, California is one of the chief places of refuge for Armenian survivors from that genocide. And the problem that Lemkin saw was that under international law, what the Ottoman Empire had done to the Armenians was completely legal. Like, the law was completely silent on this terrible atrocity that had attracted enormous attention from the world. But there was no mechanism in international law that could try to either prevent what the Ottoman state had done to the Armenians, or indeed legally punish the perpetrators of that crime. And so Lemkin began to see other episodes, especially in the interwar period in Iraq and elsewhere, of where states were attempting to destroy minority populations and do so in a way that would escape any kind of international intervention, or they wouldn't be held accountable. And he was really concerned about this. I mean, he was concerned about this from a humanitarian perspective. He was concerned about this from a law and order perspective, and also from an international peace and security perspective, in which anytime a genocide happens, anytime this mass killing takes place or is directed against people, it often sends them across international borders, creating waves of refugees, but making a world that is less safe and secure. He also explicitly mourned the loss of the culture of those people, because he had this interesting early 20th century idea that all communities and all peoples had elements of their culture that could belong to all of us. Their literature, their books, their thought, their music. And if you destroyed them, you were robbing humanity as a whole of that cultural inheritance. And so he tried to work within the system, the League of Nations in the interwar period, and he proposed a couple laws, and they were going to go into effect, he tried to get them to go into effect through a conference in Madrid in the early 1930s. But when the German delegation got word that he and other Jewish lawyers were coming, they said that they wouldn't come if the conference allowed these Jewish legal scholars to come. And these would be from Poland or France or all sorts of places, right? And so though Lemkin was never able to travel and make the proposal because they bowed to the will of an ascendant Germany. Then after the war, Lemkin fled eventually to the United States via Japan, where he got word of the destruction of most of his family in what was Poland and Ukraine. They were destroyed, they were murdered by the Nazis. And he watched come to pass during the period 1939 to 1945, the same kind of destruction of a people by a powerful state that he had seen happen first to the Armenians in 1915. And that was the Holocaust, right? And he was really one of the very first scholars to understand that the Nazi destruction of the Jewish people was part of a plan not to move them, not to relocate them, but actually to destroy them as a people. And he also saw this happening to other peoples in Europe at the time, Slavic peoples and the Roma, which is another ethnic minority in Europe. And so this is where he brings his ideas together that he first proposed in Madrid, and he coins the term genocide, meaning the murder of a people. Genos, people, side, are suffix for murder. And that process, that idea caught fire. Because in the wake of the Second World War, international lawyers, activists, states, civil society organizations were trying to find a word to explain the horror that the Second World War had brought upon the Jewish people and others. And so genocide was the word that could explain what could happen. It was the naming of the crime of crimes. And so eventually, the United Nations is founded, and a committee is established to transform Lemkin's ideas about genocide into international law. And that's where the problem starts. Because Lemkin's idea was a broad transhistorical understanding of genocide where states destroy peoples, they destroy their culture, they destroy them they kill them, they starve them, they prevent births amongst them, they take their children and raise them as their own. This broad, very sympathetic and humane understanding of that process, and once in the hands of the international lawyers and under pressure from colonial governments, including the United States, that comprehensive nature was chipped away, slowly but ardently, I think would be the best word, to the point where what ends up emerging with the genocide, eventually what's called the Convention for the Prevention and the Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, is a pale shadow of this comprehensive idea that Lemkin had first proposed. And in that final convention, it's missing many of the critical elements that I argue would have made genocide a powerful tool for justice.
And one of the things that you've identified, and I imagine, even though the word genocide hadn't been around during the Armenian genocide, what we now refer to, is the distinction between something that you intend to happen, where you have to prove intent, versus something that you just do. And if it's like, well, we could sleight of hand justify it through a little bit of language tweaking.
Right.
Is that accurate?
I mean, that's I use the word legerdemain in my writing, which is sleight of hand. That is absolutely correct. I mean, in my work, and I think for our purposes, there's two broad areas of Lemkin's ideas that were extracted, that were taken out, that should be looked at both independently and combined, right? So the first is this question of intent. So the Genocide Convention says that genocide is the intent to destroy a people in whole or in part. But that wasn't in Lemkin's original language. He merely used the word purpose, with the purpose to destroy them, right? The word intent was brought into the convention primarily by the American delegation to the committee. Dean Rusk, who was a junior diplomat at the time, but eventually would rise to be Secretary of State, Dean Rusk was very concerned, as were many in the American State Department, but also the American Bar Association, which was led in those days by a racist and xenophobic man from the Pacific Northwest who believed that the UN was just going to bring about a kind of rule by atheists and communists and people of color. They were very worried that the Genocide Convention, as they saw it, would be applied to the way that African Americans were treated in the American South. In other words, that Jim Crow would be genocide, and the lynchings and the state terror that African Americans faced from the Civil War era forward was genocide. And at the time, and this is very important for my own work, at the time there was no consideration of indigenous people, like Native Americans, as being this didn't even cross people's mind. And so Rusk made sure that the word intent was inserted specifically so that states could merely say, you don't really have evidence that we were trying to kill these people, right? Because what purpose does, purpose turns on this objective and real world outcome of action by perpetrators, things that we can see with our own eyes, right? And I think from my perspective, my research, what it does is that it centers the lived historical experience of victims in any conversation, right? It puts the victim and their story, their histories, their experience at the center of whether or not this is genocide. And then what happens, though, is that with intent, what we're trying to find out is what was in the mind of the perpetrator. So it shifts the whole conversation, the whole debate from understanding what had happened to the victims to trying to figure out what the perpetrators had in mind, regardless of what they actually did. And so it was, as you said, it was a trick. It was a trick. It was a sleight of hand. And that has really haunted genocide ever since then. Because I was just reminded recently, last year, the United States, actually it was like 2 years ago now, the United States issued a finding of genocide in Sudan. And the genocide in Sudan is ongoing. One of the rebel groups that had 20 years ago, when I talked about this even on Davis 20 years ago, was engaged in genocide against the people of Darfur. That militia is still there, and they've occupied a major urban center where they are destroying hospitals, killing people, burning books, destroying libraries. So the United States said, genocide is happening in Darfur. We believe that there is we can show the intent. And then when that same American diplomatic spokesman was challenged about what Israel was doing in Gaza, it's not that the American State Department spokesman said, "Oh, war crimes aren't happening, people aren't dying." All she had to say was, "Oh, we don't find any intent." So it's a very cynical move that was introduced at the time, and I always remember that I was taught in high school that a diplomat is a gentleman who lies for his country, and that's what Rusk did in this case. The other half of this, though, and this is something that is very important for us as we understand how genocide takes place alongside colonialism, and especially settler colonialism in places like where we live in California, is that the architects of the Genocide Convention specifically removed any reference to culture, the destruction of culture. And so for Lemkin, this was very important. And when we think about genocide is destroying a people. Well, what makes a people? Is it just them physically and biologically? That's part of it. But what makes them people? What are the tendons that hold them together? It's their language, it's their art, it's their history, it's their food ways, it's their use of the environment, right? It's their children. And so primarily in forms of colonial genocide, but even in the genocide of the Armenians, there was an effort to destroy those elements as well. Burn churches, destroy books, right? I mean, Lemkin talks about this. He narrates in his great work on genocide, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. He talks about the burning of one of the great Jewish libraries in Poland, and how the Jewish people of that town were forced by the Nazis to gather around this great pile of burning books. And that the German officers were bothered by the fact that these people were wailing and crying and just so sad that he had the band play music to cover it up. And then also, even in the United States, we have this history of taking indigenous children, Native American children, sending them to boarding schools where we strip them of what it means to be Indian, what it means to be Native, to try to make them more acceptable to white dominant society, right? And that, when we think about cultural genocide, one of the best ways to imagine it is what an American general who was running a lot of the boarding school process said in the 1890s, which was, we don't want to kill all the Indians. We don't want to do that, but rather we want to kill the Indian that is in him and save the man. So that's genocide, right? So all those cultural elements of genocide, especially cultural elements of genocide that would have allowed the law to be pointed at France or Belgium in the Congo, France in Algeria, the United States or Great Britain in Australia, all of that was ripped out, just left on the floor. And so what I argue is that we're at a crossroads in a way where we can either just stick with this old genocide idea that comes to us through this law. And law is very powerful. Law helps us define our world around us. It becomes allegedly a neutral measuring stick where we can gauge if this is genocide or that's not genocide. I argue that every time we apply the Genocide Convention, we're actually reenacting its racist and colonialist origins. And that instead, in this moment, there's so much discussion because of what's happening in Gaza, but also what's happening in Sudan and other parts of the world, that this is a moment where we need to reflect as historians, lawyers, diplomats, journalists, activists. We need to reflect on whether or not we want to actually reject the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention and instead embrace something that's more akin to a popular understanding of it that is closer to Lemkin's original idea.
There's a lot to unpack.
Oh, yeah.
There's an awful lot. One of the big questions that has come to me while you were speaking is, my understanding from what you're saying is genocide is almost a binary, like where without intent, you're innocent. Or
you can't be charged.
You can't be charged, but it's not like, we're used to a kind of a scalable punishment in the United States legal system as far as like murder goes. Right. There is, first degree, second degree, manslaughter. We've scaled that, so you're not going to get away regardless of the motivation. Whether you had intent or not, you took a human life, you've got to pay for that or something. That's that's not the case with genocide. It's either your intention to destroy has to be provable, or we can't really help you.
So that's an important element of it, right? So imagine you're a community that has faced genocide, and you make a claim. You say, we've faced genocide, and then the pushback comes. It says you can't show intent, or you're missing certain elements of it. Instead of the conversation then turning on, well, how can we, what other justice can we seek in this case? Usually what happens is there's this rejection of the justice claim entirely, right? And so one of the ways to think about this is that if you approach genocide as just a legal problem, a legal approach to genocide tends to enfeeble the victims or enfeebles the communities seeking justice, because it often creates this unattainable this measurement that they just can't reach. They just can't fulfill the burden of proof in a way that the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, might want to prove, that the lawyerly approach. But we see this with Gaza, right? Is that people are watching this with their eyes, and their eyes are telling them, this is so horrible. This must be genocide, right? And if this isn't genocide, then what is? So they're watching it, and that disconnect between the two it undermines faith in international law. It undermines faith in human rights as an idea, right? So my response to that is saying, stop with the legal. Just abandon genocide as a legal concept. It's not working, right? And again, every time you invoke it, you're reenacting the colonial and racist origin of the law itself. The law, not the idea, the law. And instead, think about genocide as a political claim, as in the world of politics and advocacy, and as a basis for human solidarity. And so in that has the opposite effect of law which enfeebles the victim community. The political can, emphasis on can empower the community. How will it empower the community, you might ask? How does it empower? Because it builds a basis for solidarity. Because other communities have faced genocide in the past. So one of the most interesting things I saw in the protests of last year here on campus, right, was that there were young people who would come, and they would sometimes have these posters which would have two flags. One flag would be the flag of Palestine, and then the other flag would be the flag of, say, Armenia, right? And they would have these two flags together. And that what was happening was that these children of survivors of the genocide were seeing what was happening to the Palestinians, and they were making the connection with their own family, their own communities past. And it formed a solid basis for solidarity. But here's the other part, and we teach this in human rights studies, which is that there's a repertoire of human rights action. There are things that we can do to try to affect change in the world of human rights. And a lot of these were shaped by the global effort to end apartheid in South Africa. Right? And so that when we build this solidarity, what it does is it can mobilize the use of those tools. So of course, one of those tools, with in the case of Gaza and the Palestinians, was mobilized. It was bringing a case to the International Court of Justice, right? It was also getting earlier advisory opinions from the International Court that Israel's practices in the West Bank and in its own territory are akin to apartheid, for example. Then, with that legal process going, there's room for other action. And this is what we learned from South Africa, right? Is that you can't always depend on the court to do anything, right? And I'm actually very pessimistic that the International Court of Justice will in fact find genocide in Palestine, specifically because of the intent. But that doesn't mean genocide isn't happening, right? Because we can see it with our own eyes. Is that there's this repertoire of action includes economic and cultural boycotts. It includes sanctions. It includes not sending weapons or arms into a conflict area. And all of these are just very normal things that can be done in the international sphere, can be done at by civil society actors like universities, can be done by corporations making ethical decisions to stand in solidarity with people facing genocide. But I'm always still so deeply touched when I reflect back on those young people who really said, what's happening to the other students and their families overseas, that happened to us. And we're here to stand with you, right? And that made me really proud of our students, that they could see that and that they were willing to put their bodies on the line to stand in solidarity in such a way.
It's fascinating, and I agree with you. I'm blown away by this generation, by their savvy. And their energy and their, I guess maybe they rise above. They're facing some existential level challenges that I guess you got to steel yourself against it. But they seem to be more open to that whole informational thing. So I do want to get back to the Native American thing. You had mentioned
Sure.
before, like when we were talking about the Jim Crow, the situation, like the enslavement, and we don't want to be on the line or on the hook for that, for having to pay for that. We don't want to be guilty of genocide, even though it's clearly what we were doing. We'll create this language that says that wasn't our intent. Our intent was to generate an economy or something like that, however they wanted to justify it. You mentioned that Native Americans weren't even really on the radar. They weren't really being considered. Obviously, slavery, first thing we've got to deflect from, right? But retroactively, we've gone back and looked at Native Americans, and that was, by almost any definition, because our intention was clearly to remove them, or to at least reduce their power, and then
to destroy them and take over their land,
and to save the man.
Right. Well, even that. I mean, so I like the fact that you said this is clear, because had we been sitting in this studio a mere 20 years ago, like I did, it would not have been clear. American historians in particular, British historians and in general, Australian historians, South American, that they would have said, no, what happened to the indigenous people was not genocide, because there was no intent. It was, they died of disease, there was a haphazard policies against them. There wasn't response. They call this, it's sort of shifting the blame and blaming the environment or blaming local actors. And in the 20 years since, amongst my colleagues and I, there's been a really concerted effort to try to push back hard against that. And that pushback has not just come from the historians, but also from indigenous communities themselves, who are saying, no, what happened to us was genocide. And what I find this is sort of a side note, what I find really wonderful about that is a lot of those claims of genocide don't happen in places you would imagine they happen, right? They don't happen in history books. They're there, or articles. They happen in rap music, right? They happen in tattoos. They happen in song and poetry and dance, that there's like genocide. They try to destroy us as a people. Again, it's like what happened at the end of the Second World War, when the world community was sort of grasping for a word, just a word, to say this is what happened, right? So genocide, that word, and why it's so powerful, and why we have to actually try to save it as a concept, actually, that word was the word that community activists and indigenous leaders seized on to define what had happened to them. Because to that point, there was not really a good way to describe massacres, right? Relocation, right? These often feel more euphemistic than accurate in their portrayal. And so one of the things that I work on, sort of one of the late phases of genocide. I publish extensively on the treatment of children during genocide, and also in these boarding schools. But that's often at the very end of a genocidal process, right? That is usually preceded by murder, pushing people off the land, destroying their environment and economy. And California as a state has a 200-year plus history of Europeans coming here and destroying the indigenous people, enslaving them, taking their land, and destroying their resources, right? But the problem is it's not like they're going to be able to bring a suit against the United States government for doing this, in part because the U.S. would have to give permission for them to do so. But this is woven now into a lot of international law about for indigenous people. One of the things that we study in genocide and write about is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And it clearly says indigenous people should not face genocide. They shouldn't have their children taken from them. They shouldn't have their land taken. And it's always remarkable to me that we have to write this down. But the fact that we had to write it down means that it happened and is happening.
I'm going to fringe off of the whole intention thing, and I'm going to go into motivation, rationale. Like after the fact, you can create a narrative that absolves you of anything legally. But what's to be? I mean, and I should say, back in the days when resources were not quite as predictable, we didn't actually have the capacity to feed, clothe, house everyone on the planet the way we do today. And it was very much more competitive by almost by, evolutionary design, or if you, that's conflicting. Like evolution suggests that those who can compete and win for resources will get the resource. Ergo, if we can silence this group of people who are sitting on land that we could grow food on, it'll be ours and we'll win. That dynamic is not as prevalent anymore. We have the capacity to provide for everyone. Do you see a time when intent or motivation will kind of fade away? Will we ever hit that enlightenment period? And have you seen historically different facets of motivation? Like, why do people commit genocide? And are there like, well, this is a type A, a type B, a type C, or something like that?
Let's dive into a part of that question.
Sure.
Which is like, when does genocide end, right? When does it end, right? Is it when you've killed everyone, right? So one of my working ideas is that once genocide is started, it generally doesn't end, actually. It just continues. It's just woven in to the society that perpetrated it and almost naturalized in the way that they relate to either any survivors of the genocide or even to their memory. So one of the things that we study a lot here and we talk about a lot here at UC Davis and I've written about is this idea that all genocides are denied. All genocides are denied. Right? The Armenian genocide is denied officially by the government of Turkey, right? And they spend lots and lots of money. I was even attacked by representatives of the Turkish government for articles I've written here at UC Davis, talking about the Armenian genocide. The Holocaust is denied, and this is very important because Holocaust denial is we see as a canary in the coal mine for larger pathologies, right? So usually people are denying the Holocaust. There's other things going on that should be important for us to understand from a social perspective, right? But also the denial of genocide of indigenous people by states in particular is important because denial is the first step, acknowledgement is the first step to repair. Right? Genocide may continue, but that doesn't stop us from trying to repair the damage, right? And so one of the reasons why I'm arguing for this different approach to genocide, right? Not the legal approach. Because I think it was you'll accuse a government of doing it, they'll get off, they won't have to acknowledge it, right? That's usually the outcome, right? You approach it through the International Criminal Court. Genocide is one of the crimes against humanity. You convict some second or third tier bureaucrat for doing it, which is generally what's happened over the last 30 years since the Rwandan genocide trials. None of those approaches anticipate repair or lead to repair. And repair can be all sorts of things, from acknowledgement to the inclusion of the stories of genocide in curriculum, to the repatriation of land and lost cultural heritage, right? To the integration of formerly of communities that face genocide into political structures so that they can have a role in society. All of these things are possible, but they're impossible in the face of denial. So this is one of our jobs, actually. This is one of our jobs at UC Davis, is to confront the denial of genocide. And that's the denial of the Holocaust, the denial of the Armenian genocide, the denial of the genocide of indigenous peoples, the denial of genocide against African Americans, that it's one of our jobs to use our scholarship and our teaching to confront that. Because it's beyond just getting it right. It's beyond that, right? We should always strive for accuracy, for evidence-based conclusions and analysis, but the stakes are really high in getting it wrong about genocide. Because if we get it wrong, we contribute to denial, we fail to push back against denial, then we can't move to the next step, which is repair.
You mentioned something like the Holocaust deniers, and I'm baffled if there was ever an airtight case for genocide by intent. I mean, they pretty much had a campaign that broadcast their intent, did they not?
Well, it's not. It's usually not. That's not what most Holocaust denial turns on. It either turns on, oh, there weren't that many killed. It's almost always interlaced with forms of anti-Semitism already, right? So usually a Holocaust denier is also an anti-Semite, right? So these are both social pathologies, in my opinion, right? In the opinion of others as well. These are social pathologies. They're actually very dangerous, and usually it leads to a very conspiratorial mindset. Sometimes it has its origins in sort of a religious orthodoxy. But in both cases, there's no possibility. Generally, you can't unpersuade someone about that's already a Holocaust denier. So, right, but you just have to make sure that you can control the extent of their behavior and be able to call them out for doing so. But what I argue and others argue is that usually when you see it, there's a lot of other problems that are going along with it, right? Including radicalism and a propensity towards violence. But I think this is also true in other ongoing genocides when states just refuse to acknowledge them. How do you move towards peace? How do you move towards reconciliation? I mean, all of these things are just not possible. So Holocaust denial has always struck me, and it strikes most people like, what? Right? And for that world of denial, it's this closed, encapsulated world. Oh, it all makes sense. And the more evidence you put into it to try to persuade them, all it does is just confirm them, because it's like climate denial, it's like anti-vaccination denial, forms of denial, that evidence is not really, it's not evidence-based, right? And that's what we're all about at a university, right? I mean, there's a very famous saying, I think attributed to Michael Dyson Thomas, that you can never, or Einstein, someone, Mark Twain, who knows? One of these guys said, you can never reason someone out of a position they weren't reasoned into in the first place.
Yeah. I absolutely feel that. We talk about the future as you see it.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. Give me your best case, worst case scenario as pertains to the future of genocide.
So I think all right. So I think that the past evidence suggests, it's like our 401ks, like can't always predict what's going to happen in the future, but it's pretty good sense of how these things are going. Past evidence suggests that international efforts to prevent genocide invariably fail. Right? Also, if you've been successful in preventing genocide, you may not even know it. You may not know that it's happened. One of the things that was very important over the last 20 years is that there's been a broader effort in the community of scholars of genocide to create a body of early warning signs that are shared with diplomats and journalists and governments. And many of these have to do with violence against minority communities, increased economic precarity amongst the elite, sense of insularity, and most importantly, a culture of impunity. Right? And this is one of the things we study a lot in human rights studies, is what happens when perpetrators of violence and human rights abuses are never held accountable. It creates a culture of impunity where those episodes of violence manifest more and more and more. So these early warning signs are very important. But whether or not states act on them, or the international community acts on them to prevent them, or to use them as the basis for forms of action, are different. That's a different question. I think that my great worry is that we've permitted so many genocides to take place over the last quarter century. And great states have been complicit in these genocides, and not necessarily committing them, but in failing to prevent them, right? Especially by putting pressure on their allies to stop funding them or stop doing them. That the signal is being sent to potentates and autocrats and authoritarian dictators around the world, if you do it, you're probably going to get away with it, right? And so I would argue that unless really, we are at an inflection point on this. If we fail to take action now, we'll continue to send this signal of permissibility to dictators and others that the extermination of unwanted minorities is just fine. It's just fine. You may get there might be a resolution in the UN, but there'll be no action taken. Because one of the things that we teach our students is that this was historically true. Before as the Holocaust was beginning to take shape in Europe, an AP reporter goes to Adolf Hitler and says, "Aren't you worried? Aren't you worried that you'll face international condemnation for your treatment of the Jews and others? Aren't you concerned about this?" And Hitler responds, "Who now speaks of the Armenians?" Right? So, we don't want to be in a situation down the line where people are saying, who now speaks of the Sudanese? Who now speaks of the Palestinians? We don't want to be in that position, right?
We stand on the shoulders of the giants,
right,
who genocided.
But it also says this, so much of our contemporary world order, this liberal world order we're trying to defend, rules-based international order, formed at the end of the Second World War, where we're not going to do this again. We're not going to go to international war and kill millions of people and destroy economies, and we're not going to permit the destruction of peoples. Right? We made that commitment to ourselves and to future generations in 1945, and we did it just down the road in San Francisco, by the way. And that consensus, that rules-based order, and I'm not the first one to say this, I think this is a general sense, it's eroding, and it's eroding really quickly, right? It's like, seaside erosion. It starts small, but when it really gets going, it gets going. And so I think we're at that moment as this, this rules-based order is like a house balanced on a cliff above the sea, very precariously so, right? And the sea is eroding it away, and that house is in danger of falling. And I think that's our moment right now. And so it's beyond genocide. Genocide will just be one of the symptoms of this larger failure.
So since the end of World War II, there's been a kind of a glacial, though it may be, trend toward can't let this happen ever again. And now you're saying,
we never fulfilled that promise.
Right? It was a shared attitude almost. Right.
And it was, the people who made that promise, I think many of them really believed it, right? I'm not that cynical. I believe that in people's idealism, because I feel it too, right? I'm an optimistic idealist, but that we've utterly failed in upholding that promise since 1945. It just hasn't been fulfilled, right? And I often think about this with Rwanda. Rwanda is the genocide that I've studied extensively, and I teach it, where it's so clear to me in retrospect how preventable it was. Right? That every single warning sign was present. There were European soldiers on the ground, and the United States utterly and completely failed the people of Rwanda. So much so that Bill Clinton goes after he finishes his term in office and he apologizes, acknowledging that we utterly failed, right? Well, the apology is nice, right? But we're supposed to learn from that, right? We're supposed to learn from that. And we aren't. This learning is not taking place. And so we have a future in which genocide will become more common, especially if we are unable to address successfully what's happening to peoples in the Middle East and in Africa right now. But we also, this is I think, another side of this, which is that a better acknowledgement of our own. I'm now talking about the United States. A better acknowledgement of our own responsibility for the commission of genocide in a much more full-throated way can help demonstrate the possibilities for a more just society, right? And what I'm afraid of, and I've shared this work with you and through the magazine, right, is that the tools that we use as a nation to teach ourselves and our children about this kind of past for which we should take responsibility, those are being erased as well, right? From our parks, from our great national museums. There's a fear, if you will, of acknowledging violence and genocide in the American past because it somehow diminishes us in the present. And I don't understand that impulse at all, right? But that seems to be driving much of what's happening in our public and private higher education and our museums and parks. And again, UC Davis should play an important role in the pushback, right? We have this incredible depth in all of these fields that we should be confident that we should be on the leading edge of pushing back against this assault on truth and memory, right?
I would extend that to all of higher education.
All of higher education, but this is our house,
right? Exactly.
And I'm worried that I see signs, unfortunately, that I think we're not meeting the challenge.
I'm gonna veer off,
okay,
but not too far.
Okay.
I know you're a huge Star Trek fan.
I am, and
I know that a lot of what you have researched, you see allegorized in the text of Star Trek.
Sure.
Star Trek. I mean, it might not ultimately be the happiest of endings. I mean, there's no ending there, and there's constantly conflict within. But there seems to be this milestone that they have achieved, that civilization has achieved. It's it is a galactic community that has found some commonality around goodness that occasionally has to fight.
It's very pragmatic. Star Trek has a very pragmatic vision of the future, right? And the two pillars of that pragmatic utopian future are two things we've yet to achieve, right? One is that they imagine a future in which there is no want, that people have what they need. There's no precarity, to borrow a term from economics, because energy is plentiful and resources are distributed equally, right? So barely money is ever talked about in Star Trek, right? But it's this idea that the competition for resources, for power, for land, this is no longer important, right? Although in the conflict with other species and other empires and so on it is, right? And there's like all sorts of great internal contradictions and critiques you can make of Star Trek's vision for this. And the other is that is a kind of emphasis on idealism and competency. That competence and professionalism is built around adherence to a certain group of core values and ideas, right? So a Starfleet officer has these core principles that propels him or her into their work, and they do it efficiently and cheerfully, and it works, right? And so I think that's what's very, very, and that motivation is not the accumulation of wealth, it's the implementation and mobilization of those ideals, right? And and what I find so attractive about it is I don't see this as being so far beyond our grasp. I mean, it's beyond our reach in a way, but I think we can get it, right? I don't see any reason why we couldn't. It'll just take a while. But Star Trek is also, like any good science fiction, it provides an opportunity for us to think about really difficult topics at a remove from our day-to-day, right? Where we can think about colonialism and genocide, and Star Trek was one of the first places where they even looked at things like same-sex relationships and disability rights and AI in a way that was safe for people to participate in. And I think that's one of the things that we can do better at UC Davis is figure out ways through our public scholarship to really invite the communities around us to have these kinds of critical conversations about what kind of society we want to be, what kind of state and nation do we want to have. And so Star Trek provided that opportunity. That's why it's so appealing to a certain subset, this increasingly smaller and smaller subset, but nonetheless, those of us who are great Trekkers are there. I often see this wonderful overlap between Trekkers and Deadheads. That's also, I think, a very important intersection of humanity.
That would be a fun party to watch, a mashup.
Yeah.
The twirling Trekkies.
Keep on trekking.
So I'm gonna take from that a little bit of hope, if you don't mind, because
sure.
What you're suggesting, like the message that Star Trek delivers, is that the society is possible. There's an appetite out there for this now. I mean, you see it in the streets of the United States now.
I think so. I mean, so I in this other part of my UC Davis existence, I direct the Article 26 backpack. Right. The Article 26 backpack is a tool and ecosystem named for the 26th article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that says that everyone has a right to education. And so it's a tool we developed to try to help refugee young people safely store and curate their most important academic documents. Right? We developed it first for Syrian refugees 8 years ago, and it's been used in East Africa, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, we're helping young people in America now who are facing deportation or other forms of forced relocation. And it's a great tool. It's a tool that I think my students, they look at it as a way, they want pragmatic ways to contribute to doing good, right? And I think that's wonderful. But our motto, we have a motto. And our motto is, hope is good, a plan is better. So hope is great. Hope is good. But one of the things that we're trying to do in higher education is provide a space for people to imagine and think about the future they want to inhabit and how to get there, right? So the best educators are the ones who not only can inspire young people to imagine this future, but work with them to identify the kinds of tools that they need to have to get there. And I think we have those tools. We just haven't. It's like a bad trip to IKEA. We just haven't figured out how to put it together yet. And someone's lost the Allen wrench, so we have no idea. So that's where I think we are. And I'm glad that you have some hope. I think that's important. But I would encourage you to make a plan.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. And I will hold my elected officials to the same, as I think we all should. I think we've been rudderless as far as that plan goes for a little bit too long, but we'll see. Anyway, did we miss anything? Is there anything?
No, these are great. I mean, I'm always wanting us to remember that the humanities stand at the center of everything we have just talked about. And I think that we're demonstrating why what we do in the humanities is important. This is not easily dismissed as some kind of extra. This is basic. We have this kind of if we want to succeed as a humanity, the humanities have to be part of that success. And we neglect them at our own peril. So again, everything we've talked about, if it's important to you, if it's something that spoke to you, it has its origin in what we as humanities scholars do.
In the human connection, in that shared experience, or the shared future, at least in theory.
The humanities tell us what it means to be human, but they can also tell us why to be human, why being human matters. Right? And I think that we sometimes lose track of that at UC Davis. But it's also because the humanities are dangerous. So if we can go to that path really quickly. One of the things I talk to my students about, like in the U.S., we love our poets, but we just, they're just poets, right? They'll show up in poetry night readings. It's great. It's great. But I study parts of the world where the first people they round up, the authoritarian dictators like to round up and put in prison or throw out of windows, are poets and writers, journalists, right? Historians. The very people whose skills we develop in the humanities, the people that we ask to tell us what it means to be human and why to be human, and that we're at a moment in American history where, I don't think we're going to throw poets out of the window anytime soon, but the powers that be view the humanities as dangerous. Because the humanities teach you how to think about what it means to be us. And they don't want that. They don't want that. They want you to just be told what to think and fall in line. And so as an institution, if we lose sight of that, as we talked about earlier, we're complying in advance. Right? So preserving and promoting the humanities is not just about making sure that we teach German, which is great, right? We've got to do that. It's about defending our own humanity.
This machine kills fascists.
That's right. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely, Guthrie.
Absolutely. All right. Well, point very well taken and very much appreciated. And thank you for being with us today. It's great to talk to you.
Great. Thank you.
Sincerest thanks to today's guest, Keith Watenpaugh. If you'd like to learn more about Keith and his work, check out our YouTube page for links to his bio, books, articles, research, and more. And thank you for joining Minds Over Matters today. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe, share with your friends, and spread the word. We have a lot to say, and we guarantee something for everybody. Minds Over Matters is hosted by Ed Kiggins, produced by the College of Letters and Science at UC Davis, and filmed at the Wyatt Pavilion. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.